The Sound of Bells. Written and read by TARDIS9. Based on the railway series by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry and Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends by Britt Allcroft and David Mitten. It was a cold, dark evening. The big engines were simmering down for the night, talking to each other about the day's events. For all his positive traits, if there was one thing that Henry the Green Engine didn't like, it was to be the subject of a trick. Unfortunately, he had been earlier that day, and he wasn't about to let anyone ignore it. "That Peter Sam!" he fumed. "First he kept me waiting for his train yesterday, and now he's gone and crept up behind me and frightened the life out of me with his whistle. He's nothing but a cheeky little mite." "Is that so?" came a voice. "Well, from what I hear, you deserved it." The big engines were surprised. Backing into the shed was a small boxy shape on wheels with cow catchers and a bell. Everyone watched as, letting off steam, Toby the Tram Engine settled himself down in the berth beside James. "From what I heard, a certain someone conveniently forgot the fact that he was a guaranteed connection and berated Peter Sam for keeping him waiting in the first place," Toby reminded. "Pah! Henry had every right to complain about that," Gordon sniffed. James looked like he wanted to say something in agreement, but then remembered his accident with the tar wagons and thought better of it. He had gained a considerable sense of respect for Toby since then, and wasn't about to say anything unwise. Gordon, however, was. "You don't understand, little Toby," he continued. "We important engines have a position to keep up. Our work on the main line demands that we use our whistles to warn others of our presence." Toby remembered Edward's story about the time Gordon's whistle was jammed and was about to ask him why he had blown his whistle all along the line. "You small, slow engines have no need of such things," Gordon continued loftily. "Especially you, little Toby. With your cow catchers, I honestly fail to see why you should use a bell and a whistle for your work. Bells and whistles are much too important for you. If you hit something, you can just push it aside. Leave the big noises to the big engines, I say." Every wise engine knows that they all need whistles and bells to warn people and animals against straying onto the line. But Gordon was so proud and Henry was so cross that they had both forgotten this. "Oh, bells and whistles are more important to us little engines than you may think," Toby replied firmly. "And why's that?" asked Henry snootily. "Because of something that happened on my old tram line," said Toby doggedly. "What happened?" asked James. "It's not nice to talk about," said Toby. "Then why bother mentioning it?" snorted Gordon. But James and Henry ignored him. "Go on, Toby," said James. "Tell us what happened," added Henry. Toby sighed and began his story. "All of this took place before I met the Fat Controller and joined the railway. Back then, I had only just arrived on the tramway. I had spent most of my working life at the docks on the mainland and was eager to explore the line. At the time, I was the only engine on the line. Unfortunately, this made me cocky. You see, I felt that I alone owned the tramway and would often brag about it to Henrietta and Elsie. Oh, we were good friends, even back then, but they would always have to check me first when I became too arrogant. I remember this one morning when I was being particularly arrogant. 'You know, Henrietta and Elsie,' I said, 'I must be the only engine trustworthy enough to run this line.' 'Says you,' Other engines may well have come before you, Toby. Don't you forget that. Pah! I snorted. They've obviously left, haven't they? That means they couldn't be trusted. Just because they've left doesn't mean they couldn't be trusted, said Elsie. Show them some respect. They could be on the scrap heap, my engine, you understand? I didn't, but I felt it wisest not to say so. Up the line, there was this stretch that ran by the roadside. Oh, it never was a place we liked passing by. You see, the cars, buses and lorries often have accidents. Now, I luckily never had an accident, though there would come a time when the buses were crowded and Henrietta was empty. But we did have our fair share of near misses, and just waiting up the line on that piece of road was one of them. As we entered that same stretch of line, I saw a small outline of a lorry in the distance. It looked as though it was on the line. Just then, the lorry driver ran up, waving his hands for us to stop. Sensing the danger that lay ahead, my driver slammed on my brakes and I came sharply to a halt, wheezing loudly. As the steam died away, the lorry driver's hands turned from waving to shaking fists. He stormed angrily up to us. What do you mean by ringing your bell at us? He demanded. Frightened the life out of me, you did. Forced me off the road. That's the whole shipment of pianos damaged now. All thanks to you and your terrible idea of a joke. But we didn't cause that, cried my driver. Exactly, I agreed. How could we? We've only just approached this stretch of road. Pah! Liars! Retorted the lorry driver. I'll be talking to your manager about this, you see if I don't. I honestly don't know why you wretched engines even have bells and whistles when all you do is just frighten the life out of us with them. He stormed angrily away. It took some time for a breakdown lorry to come and take the wreckage away. By then we were running very late indeed. I knew we had to hurry to make up for lost time. But as we rounded a bend, I could have sworn that I heard a bell ringing from behind me. I soon put that out of my mind, though. How dare that driver accuse me of making him crash? How dare he? I fumed. I mean, bells and whistles are there for us to use. Everyone knows that. If I want to ring my bell, I will. And just to make my point, I did. Toby, we understand how you feel, said Elsie. But you must understand that bells and whistles are more important than that. How? I asked. Don't you know? Replied Henrietta. They're there to protect others, to warn them when we're approaching or about to leave. Oh, I had completely forgotten that, and felt somewhat abashed. But what I didn't hear was something Henrietta said under her breath about bells and whistles also being a mark of respect. All day long, things just seemed to go wrong for me. We were late arriving at all our jobs, and I was in such a foul mood that I bumped my trucks hard. Ow, ow, ow! They screamed, and determined to pay me out. And they did. At every stop, they held their brakes hard on. Halfway through every journey, at least one axle ran hot. Each time we had to stop and put it right. Each time we were delayed at every stop. And each time I was blamed. That stupid lorry driver, I fumed. It's all his fault. Fancy, I continued, trying to blame me for his accident. Me, a complete stranger to him. If he wants me to lose my bell, he's got another thing coming. Oh, no you don't, Toby, warned Henrietta. It's not worth losing your temper over just one man. But I didn't listen and rang my bell at every opportunity. This in turn led to yet more trouble. I rang it at every station and crossing, accompanied by a blast of my whistle and a whoosh of steam, and on every stretch of line, long, loud and furiously. Farmers spilled their produce, horses upset their carts, porters tipped over their luggage, children and adults held their ears, dogs barked, cats went flying, and old ladies dropped their shopping. everyone was surprised and cross. At the top station, my manager met me. "If you can't behave, I shall send you away and get another engine to replace you," he said. I tried explaining everything to him, but he wouldn't listen. Feeling quite humiliated and depressed, I quietly collected my trucks, and we went back to one of the crossings just before the station. When we arrived there, we had to wait while the cattle trucks were loaded up with cows. It was a long, tedious operation, as the cows were new and not yet used to trains. They had been brought over from a field in a valley which had been flooded in bad weather, and were to be transferred to one close by the tram line the following morning. After waiting for an hour, we set off with the farmer riding an Henrietta. When we arrived at the farm, it was dark. The cows were unloaded, and the farmer shepherded them into the barn. Then we set off into the night. Now the thing is, my class, the GERC 53, is based on an older design, the GER 15. Of course, we were all classified in the days of the LNER. I and my brothers became J70s, and the G15s became Y6s. They were a bit smaller than us, with cylinders measuring by about 11 inches by 15 inches. This meant that with our 12-inch by 15-inch cylinders, my brothers and I were more powerful. I heard that some of the G15s worked on tramways such as ours, and were often seen along country roads, pulling goods for farms and villages, as well as some passenger services. But I had never seen any of them for myself. Up ahead of us was the same stretch of line where we had met the lorry driver. I was just making my way along it, and saw that the road beside me was empty, save for a lone cat who appeared to be approaching the line side. I rang my bell to warn it off, and was shocked to hear another ringing sound, very much like my own, but more fainter and quieter. Uncertain of what to think, I stopped. The sound came again. "Henrietta." "Elsie," I asked. "What's that?" But neither of them answered. They both seemed much too scared to do so. Nervously, I asked my driver and fireman to look around to see if they could find where the bell had been coming from. I hadn't felt too concerned about it earlier. But now I wasn't so sure. They told the guard, who took charge of the train, while they walked up the line. We sat there, cold and alone, with the same bells ringing every so often. The crew came back some moments later, feeling quite shaken up. "We went all along the line," said the driver, looking pale. But... "Nothing," finished the fireman worriedly. "But we heard something. We did. I know we did," I cried. The driver and fireman just looked at each other. Then they slowly climbed up and back into my cab. We prepared to carry on our journey home. But our troubles were not yet over. Not by a long shot. Just as my crew had returned to the footplate, we could feel a slight wind blowing in our faces. My driver and fireman hurriedly busied themselves in their work, and Henrietta and Elsie closed their eyes tightly. I, however, didn't know what to think. I just sat there, letting off steam. Or at least, I thought I was. After all, how else could I explain how it seemed to appear in front of me, even if I didn't feel it coming out of me? But then, just as my brakes had been released and we were about to move off, I saw it. A figure of an engine coming slowly out of the steam, right towards me. It looked a little bit like me, except they had smaller cylinders, and his face was twisted into an expression of sadness and despair.
The sound that we make
Its mouth made not a word, but I could have sworn I distinctly heard a voice say, "Remember, mark of sound that we make is a mark of respect." The figure slowly moved over to me. It touched my buffer beams. It passed through my cabin face. It went deep into my boiler. Then it was gone. The wind dropped, and the steam disappeared. I still did not know what to think. I just waited until I felt my driver open the regulator and puffed slowly away. Not one of us said a word. We were all too frightened out of our wits after that ordeal. We got back to the sheds. I had just shunted the trucks away and moved Henrietta and Elsie onto their siding. As I was being uncoupled, Henrietta spoke up. "You never were the only engine on this line, Toby," she said. "Rather, you were the second. I was told about this by the guard soon after we arrived. You were too busy arranging our train to pay much attention, so I doubt if you heard all that much. But there was once another engine, a tram engine like yourself, called Tristram, who worked on this line. He was a kindly old engine, who did all his work without fuss, rang his bell at every crossing, farm and station, to either warn others of his approach or give them a friendly greeting, and almost certainly sought no trouble. But his life was eventually plagued with misfortune. He had grown old. His bearings were worn and he was leaking steam. His crew had been forced to resign. The driver, upon discovering that his wife had a terminal illness and intending to spend what little time he had left with her. The fireman, for the promise of a new job, a career on the Yard as a driver. A spare crew had been found to cover such duties until a permanent duo was employed, but they had no respect for him, considering him to be an ancient relic. They often told him as much, no matter how hard he worked. Finally, after months of one affliction after another, the manager came to him. This man came before ours, and was a mean-spirited type who valued money more than anything else. He told Tristram that another engine had been purchased. Tristram was hopeful that this new engine would work alongside him, until the manager informed him that he had been sold, and was to be cut up on sight for scrap that day. Poor Tristram tried to protest against this, for it had always been his greatest of fears, as is with all vehicles, to be scrapped. But the manager would have none of it. Oh, well, Tristram screamed as the workman dismantled his outer body. No more. How he begged and pleaded for mercy when they took blow torches to his side plates.
Mercy, please, have mercy. I beg you. No, please, no.
And now he cried out in pain, desperation and sadness as they cut up his boiler.
No.
His dying screams only fell silent as his smoke box door was cut away from him. They left his remains there overnight, while they arranged for a horse and cart to pick them up the following day. They did, just as that new engine arrived. And do you know who that new engine was, Toby? It was you. The manager was replaced eventually. The board found out that he had been embezzling funds from the company, and he was sacked immediately with a hefty fine. He was replaced with our own manager, I'm glad to say. But Tristram's spirit still lives on, along that same stretch of line where we saw him. When the weather is still and quiet, you can sometimes hear the sound of a bell ringing out along the line. And when it is night time, and under similar conditions, you can also see a faint figure of a tram engine puffing along the line. Perhaps Tristram was so afraid of dying that his spirit found some means of living again, as a ghost. As he rang his bell to greet and warn others, So locals have come to regard its sound as a mark of respect for his passing, like that of a memorial for a person, animal, or vehicle. I remained silent as Henrietta finished her story. I had a lot to think about. And so that is the old story, Toby concluded. Let this be a lesson to all. Bells and whistles are there for a reason. They are there to warn others of our approach, and can be used to give a friendly greeting when appropriate. But above all else, they must be treated with the utmost respect. One day, they could be the last thing anyone will ever recognize us by. I understand your feelings about Peter Sam's trick, Henry, and suggest you tell him all this tomorrow. But you too must understand what I have to say. You bigger engines claim that all those who are smaller than you should not have such things, yet you are so wrong. Deny anyone a bell or a whistle, and you take away something from them. For you see, sometimes the sound of bells and whistles are all that we have left of ourselves, who we once were, and why we are gone, to ensure that we are never truly forgotten. The big engines remained silent for a long while. They pondered over what Toby had said, and Gordon and Henry began to feel remorseful for their attitudes towards the little tram engine. Eventually, one by one, the 4 engines drifted off to sleep. But the 3 big engines remained respectfully silent for several days after that. And, for a long time afterwards, nothing more was said on the subject of bells and whistles.
The sound that we make is a mark of respect. The sound that we make is a mark of respect. Is a mark of respect. The sound that we make is a mark of respect. The sound that we make is a mark of respect. The sound that we make is a mark of respect. Remember, the sound that we make is a mark of respect. The sound that we make is a mark of respect. The sound that we make is a sound that we make is a mark of respect. The sound that we make is a mark of respect. The sound that we make is a mark of respect. The sound that we make is a mark of respect.